On Saturday, October 23, 2077, the long-awaited moment finally arrived as atomic bombs rained down across the world, extinguishing human civilization in a matter of hours. As America's greatest cities and achievements were wiped off the map one by one, the nation's highest leaders, its most prominent corporate, scientific, and military officials, watched the destruction from safety, spread across the world in dozens of specially prepared and fortified installations. Chief among these was a deep-sea drilling platform hidden in the vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean, specially equipped and completely self-sufficient. It was here the president and his closest advisors began to set their plans in motion to retake the wasteland once known as the United States, restore the control of the rightful government, and eliminate the threat of communism forever, all in the name of the Enclave. While nearly unrecognizable when compared to its pre-war counterpart, the Enclave was obsessive in its desire to be recognized as the legitimate successor to the United States. It retained much of its pre-war iconography and governmental structure, including some form of Congress, Atomic Energy Commission, Department of the Army, Secret Service, and many other branches. These varied considerably, however, from effective divisions of service to largely symbolic agencies existing purely for ceremonial or propaganda purposes. For decades after the Great War, the Enclave was content to remain hidden on its oil rig, monitoring background radiation levels across the wasteland and observing as society slowly began to rebuild itself. What they saw horrified them. Bands of psychotic mutants, malicious raiders, rogue machines, and all manner of aggressive mutant creatures fought over the remains of once great cities, while even the more civilized settlements rebuilt themselves in a perverted reflection of pre-war America. Disgusted by the effects of radiation and the pervasive mutation that had occurred across the continent, the Enclave grew increasingly xenophobic and isolationist, eventually considering themselves to be the last known concentrated bastion of pure, unmutated humanity. As a result, no attempt was made to recruit additional manpower from outside the Enclave. Instead, they relied on their formidable technology to achieve their goals. These included some of the most advanced prototypes of pre-war armor and weaponry, methodically preserved and improved upon across the centuries. Combined with one of the last known sources of fossil fuel in the post-nuclear world, which was used to supply their fleet of vertibird transports, the Enclave was one of the best equipped and trained organizations in the entire wasteland, more than a match for the disparate communities on the mainland, who had never seen so much as a working car before. Once background radiation levels had subsided to acceptable levels, the Enclave used its vertibirds to conduct scouting missions all across California, the closest state to their oil rig and a prime candidate from which to commence the rebirth of America. One such mission discovered the remnants of Mariposa Military Base, a site of great interest to the Enclave due to its role before the war in the development of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV. The FEV was responsible for the creation of the wasteland's first supermutants, brutal and aggressive creatures gifted with immense strength and endurance while immune to disease and radiation. Considered the greatest threat to the success of the Enclave, it was hoped that the FEV might be repurposed into a biological weapon with which to wipe out the supermutants. Mariposa Military Base had been left in a state of ruin following some previous battle, but Enclave construction teams, augmented by slave labor conscripted from local settlements, were put to work excavating the site. Eventually, the Enclave gained access to the lowest levels of the facility and uncovered vats containing intact samples of the FEV. Dozens of miners and other Enclave personnel were inadvertently exposed to the FEV during its discovery, including Frank Horrigan, a Secret Service agent for Enclave President Dick Richardson. Those affected slowly transformed into a second generation of supermutants, overthrowing their guards and leading a revolt against the Enclave. Meanwhile, Frank was evacuated back to the oil rig for further study. The entrance to Mariposa was blasted shut, and the remaining mutants were trapped inside. With the FEV in hand, Enclave scientists began conducting a series of experiments, abducting vault dwellers to use as test subjects, creating a race of intelligent death claws, and most significantly, achieving their goal for a biological weapon capable of eradicating not only the super mutants, but the majority of the Wasteland's mutated and impure human population. Just as the Enclave was preparing to launch their new virus into the atmosphere, a mysterious champion from an obscure northern tribe managed to repair an ancient tanker in San Francisco Bay and used it to reach the Enclave's hidden oil rig. This Chosen One, as he is known in Wasteland myth and legend, supposedly destroyed not only the Enclave's base of operations, but also Frank Horrigan, who had been transformed into a living weapon and encased in power armor as a means of keeping him alive. How much of this is true and how much has been embellished over the years by overly theatrical Wasteland chroniclers remains unknown. What is certain is that the Enclave experienced some sort of calamity on the West Coast, and its headquarters was destroyed. Leaderless and vulnerable, the majority of its surviving personnel were led east by a high-ranking scientist named Autumn, who had apparently been contacted by the new Enclave president, John Henry Eden. Of those who refused to flee, many were eventually hunted down and destroyed by the Brotherhood of Steel and the New California Republic. The group led by Autumn eventually reached President Eden, establishing a new headquarters at Haven Rock, a military base on the outskirts of the former capital, Washington, D.C. Here, the Enclave began to reassert itself, commandeering abandoned military equipment and building a network of outposts across the capital wasteland. These attempts were not uncontested, however, and the Enclave found itself once again at odds with the Brotherhood of Steel. When Autumn died, his son, Augustus Autumn, was selected to take his father's place, commanding the armed forces and becoming the sole point of contact between President Eden and the rest of the Enclave. In contrast to its efforts on the West Coast, the Enclave adopted new techniques in the capital, embracing the value of propaganda rather than brute force alone. A fleet of iBots roamed the wasteland, spreading patriotic music and inspiring speeches from President Eden promising a return to the glory days of America. Yet despite the benevolent direction the Enclave had seemingly adopted in Washington, it had never swayed from its original intentions, and President Eden's true goal was to find a method capable of disseminating the modified forced evolutionary virus. An opportunity presented itself when the Enclave became aware of a water purification effort known as Project Purity, spearheaded by a group of local scientists. The project was intended to cleanse the Potomac River, giving the capital wasteland a limitless supply of clean water. By injecting Project Purity with the FEV, the Enclave could accomplish what they had failed to achieve on the West Coast, the death of every super mutant, ghoul, and wastelander. President Eden attempted to recruit another mythological hero of the wasteland known as the Lone Wanderer in his efforts, hoping to use him as a double agent within the Brotherhood of Steel. Yet Eden was opposed by Augustus, who saw greater value in commandeering Project Purity to use as a bargaining chip against the other factions of the region. During a battle between the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave at the Jefferson Memorial, Augustus was defeated by the Lone Wanderer, and the Enclave devastated after repeated attacks by the Brotherhood's superweapon, Liberty Prime. Of what became of President Eden and Project Purity, none can say with certainty, and various stories have spread across the wasteland in the ensuing years. Some have even suggested that Eden was not a man at all, but some type of thinking machine imbued with the minds of pre-war presidents. Of the Enclave itself, they are likely a doomed organization, reduced to scattered and isolated outposts across the capital wasteland, and elderly veterans living in secret across the New California Republic are occasionally exposed, arrested, or executed by the local authorities. Yet with an organization as sophisticated and resourceful as the Enclave, there remains the ever-present possibility that some as of yet undiscovered base is working in secret to achieve the dreams of their forefathers and cleanse the wasteland of the impure and the undeserving. The Templin Institute investigates nations, organizations, and factions from alternate worlds and realities. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Do you have a suggestion for a future episode? Let us know by leaving a comment.